Welcome to Photoactive, a podcast about photography and technology. I'm Kirk McElhearn.
And I'm Jeff Carlson.
You can find show notes, including any photos we discuss in this episode, at photoactive.co. That's photoactive.co. Today we're happy to welcome David Young. David Young has recently published a book called A Brief History of Photography, which actually it's not that brief because it goes from around 1800 to the present. So I think the title should be A Very Long History of Photography. David, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. The brief in the title, by the way, comes not from being a short book, but from the nature of the entries, because I cover almost 300 years, and to cover everything from the history, the chemistry, the developing cameras, to a few photographers, magazines, the whole thing, to give an idea, an overall idea of what has happened, how we got to where we are. Each entry has to be short.
And we're going to cover all of them today.
We're going to go one by one. We're going to discuss each one, yes. When you look through the book, you realize just how complex the history of photography is. If we look back and we think about what we know about photography, we know about Daguerre, we know about, who was the guy who shot the photos in the Civil War?
Matthew Brady.
Matthew Brady. We know about early 20th century photography. We know about war photography, but we don't know all the details, all the little things that come in with each chemical discovery and each mechanical discovery. How long did it take you to write this and to research all of this?
The book started out as an idea for an appendix to a book that never got written back in 2004. And the research consumed the next 16 years of my life as the appendix took on a life of its own.
Are you angry at the appendix? It is a huge project. Now, there are a couple of things that I noticed. And the first thing that really struck me is reading through this history, and I'm someone who actually reads books about history, and I know enough about the 19th century, is how much all of this was amateurs and hackers. That it's like the early days of computing in California. A bunch of people discovered some of these things and chemistry and lenses and film stock and all that, and they hacked for decades to turn photography into what it was in the 19th century.
That's true. Not a lot of professionals in those days, and so much was being learned about optics and chemistry, and so many people would find the right solution, but credit what happened to the wrong thing, and so it never went anywhere. And then 20 years later, someone else would come up with the same idea, but maybe get a better handle on it.
This is what all of science was in the 19th century. You can look at the science of evolution with Darwin. You can look at the science of hot air balloons, airplanes going into the early 20th century. All science was amateur until, I don't know, I guess after World War I, it started becoming more professional. I know there were scientific societies created in the 19th century, but you still couldn't really train as a scientist in that time.
True. There were groups, professional companies making equipment and chemistry before World War I, but not much before 1901, 1902. George Eastman, of course, started in the late 1880s, but there wasn't a lot happening at that point other than him, at least not at a commercial level.
What was for you, what would be the point when photography clicked?
Oh, probably with the first Leica, 1925, when it was first introduced. It was the first successful camera that went sort of to the masses, although it wasn't mass-oriented. The Kodak, which came out, the first Kodak brownies that actually were around $1. I'm forgetting the years. There's too much detail in my book for even me to remember. I think it's around 1902 or 1905. That really made it a mass market thing, but the Leica sort of brought it a step up to make it really, how can I put it, prestigious to take pictures.
Yeah, exactly. It turned it into something that was about to become an art form, I would say, once that happened.
Very much so.
When I was looking through the book, I noticed two dates that struck me was 1925 with Oscar Barnack's Leica and 1975 with the introduction of the Bayer filter and the first digital camera, though it was a massive thing and it wasn't called a digital camera. And that was 50 years apart. And we're 50 years later. What are we going to have in 2025? Do you want to make a prediction?
Oh, God, no. I think it would be very presumptuous because there's so much going on. We have no idea what's really going to come next.
We were talking before the show, and I said you can't really know what marks in history until 10 or 20 or 50 years later. So there could be things going on now around AI, for example, in relation to photography, but we won't know if they're important until the hype cycle's worn off, until the patents have become public and people can really exploit it.
That's true. That's true. You mentioned, of course, I'm going to jump back here. You mentioned about the first digital camera in 1975, which was Stephen Sassen's invention while working at Kodak. The story is well known. I've had the chance to actually play with the camera. That was kind of fun. But Sassen was prevented from talking about the camera outside of work until 2001, when he was able to write an article for the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle, announcing it and showing the first picture publicly of the camera. I thought the best part out of that article was when he pointed out that he had a bit of a pleasant surprise at that point. As he said, for 10 minutes, my kids actually thought I was cool.
Well, I can understand why Kodak wanted to keep that under wraps, because it threatened, well, of course, Kodak has since died, but it threatened the film business.
It very much so. In fact, later, Sassen and an assistant developed what would first be really called the first digital SLR style camera. And the management told them that they could market it, but they wouldn't, because it would interfere with film sales.
Yeah.
Which I think was a little short-sighted in their part, but that's the way it was.
Well, they were looking at a company. They had a lock on the market. They were the biggest seller of film and cameras in the United States and probably much of the world, and they didn't want to cannibalize their business.
Of course not.
When was the first? So early photography was, you see this in old Westerns, the person with the big camera on the tripod and the black cloth he puts over his head, and he slides back something to let the light go in, and he counts for a couple seconds and then he closes it. And this was all guesswork, which photographers developed a sort of a knack to know how long to expose a photograph. But when was the first exposure meter created that allowed photographers to better understand the process?
Oh, boy. I'd have to actually look that up in my own book.
I've actually got it. I've actually got it in front of me.
45?
1932.
32. Good for you.
See, this is the thing about us, all being book authors. Like, you put it in your book so that you don't have to have it in your brain later.
The problem with mine is I've got so many trivia entries that are background, hoping to make the book more interesting to read, that there's just more than I can remember. It's 370 pages.
Yeah, I understand.
Well, and we should probably also mention for the people who have not yet ordered the book that the way this is structured is like it is chronological. It is starting actually much earlier than I expected, because maybe just this is me coming from early 21st century. I was born in 1970. So photography, my preconceived idea of photography was, like Kirk mentioned, the photographer in the Old West with the big wagon where they would develop the pictures, like all of that. But this starts way before that, because really photography is lenses and the camera obscura, which I saw one when I went to the UK once, and it blew me away. I loved it. To just sort of shift my thinking of, well, of course, that was also photography. This was also image making and image refinement, even if it wasn't being recorded in the way that we think of it now.
Yeah, well, when the camera was basically perfected, in a basic sense. Quite some time before the chemistry caught up to being able to record the images. The camera obscura, the basic ones, were known to the Chinese in about 330 BC. And Della Porta in the early 1800s first described the camera obscura in detail that we have a record of. And he managed to use a system of mirrors and some lenses to create an upright image on a white wall inside a camera obscura of a production that would be performed outside. And he thought it would really impress all his friends, but he was actually accused of sorcery for his troubles.
It's important to note that the camera means room. Camera obscura means dark room. So the camera that we use today is not a device. It was originally a room. I find it interesting. Thomas Wedgwood in 1795, he made negative prints called photograms or sun pictures by bathing paper in a silver nitrate solution and exposing them to light. That's probably the first photography that I ever did when I was a child. You could buy these bits of paper, you'd put leaves on them and put them in the sun.
It was known as proofing out paper, and it was also used in the actinograph, the first exposure meter. You would hold the thing out to the light and see how long it took to darken to a matched tint. And that gave you your exposure in seconds.
What's interesting when you look back in history is photographs around the time of the Civil War became, I don't want to say normalized, but they became a thing that people understood, because it wasn't just the photographs of soldiers in the Civil War and battlefields, but it was what's called the carte de visite, which people would get these photographs that they would give to people as a kind of memento. And I guess previously you had these that were drawn by hand, and all of a sudden they had something that was, I'm doing air quotes, realistic, because it wasn't realistic because the people had to stay still for, a minute or so.
Yeah, it became quite a trend with the carte de visite, and never really took off in America, though. It was more a European thing. And then in the States, of course, the photography in the Civil War, everyone wanted a picture of the soldier going to war in case he didn't come back.
Yeah.
But after the war, Matthew Brady, who'd done all that photography of the Civil War and done well, basically went bankrupt, because after the war, nobody wanted the pictures of the people who weren't there. They already had the print of someone leaving. They didn't want pictures of dead bodies and so on. And he went virtually bankrupt, but was salvaged by the American government, who bought his entire collection for about $25,000, which in those days is equivalent to almost $1 million today.
Yeah.
And it cemented his reputation as the commensurate war photographer at the time, and salvaged his financial condition too.
But didn't he expose a lot of those photos in New York in particular? During the war, I believe that he exposed them and people would come to see them to get an understanding of what was happening during the war.
That, you're one up on me. I'm not familiar with that particular aspect of him.
What do you find, having written all this and read it 6 times as you were proofreading and revising, as we all do, what do you find the most interesting thing that we don't know about in photography? I'm sure there are lots. Just pick one bit of trivia or process that never made it into production or something like that.
I think the piece of trivia that I find most interesting is back in about 1966, Canon had just brought out their f/0.95 lens, and it started a whole race amongst camera makers for faster and faster lenses. Not as much concern amongst photographers for the quality of the lens, just had to be fast. And Zeiss, of course, used in their Contaflex and Contarex cameras, used a interlens shutter because they owned Compur and they owned the other great shutter maker at the time. So they wanted to use their own products. but it meant that the lens opening, the throat, as it were, of the lens mount was very small, made super fast lenses impossible. So the guy who was in charge of PR at Zeiss decided to poke a little fun at this fast glass fad that was going around. And he went into their workshop and found a condenser lens from an enlarger, which was a massive, odd-looking piece of glass. And with the help of some technicians, they grabbed some lens bits and some other stuff and made what you'd call a Franken lens. It looked amazing. It did nothing. And they decided arbitrarily that it was going to be a 40 millimeter f/0.33 lens. And they had it mounted on a Coniflex, displayed it at Photokina inside a locked case, claiming it was the fastest lens ever produced. Of course, it was complete fraud. It wouldn't even take a picture. But that didn't stop it from selling at auction in 2011 for 60,000 euros.
What was the fastest lens? Because you mentioned a 0.95. I think someone makes a 0.9 lens these days, but not much faster.
Voigtlander, which is Cosina, is making a f/0.8, and I think that's the fastest one going. There have been a few faster lenses, f/0.7 something.
But not much less because it's a logarithmic scale. So it's like Zeno's paradox. You can never get to zero there.
Exactly. And there's not much use. The f/7 point whatever were made for NASA for satellite where they needed the light.
Yeah.
But f/0.8 is the fastest. And really the difference between f/0.8 and f1 is negligible.
Yeah.
In actual use, there's just not enough difference. I know that when Leica built their f1, which was made here in Canada, the Noctilux, for many, many years. And finally, when the last fellow who knew how to make them retired, they decided to move the production to Germany. As Peter Karba, the head designer at Leica, told me, it needed a redesign anyway. So they called it a f/0.95 versus the f1. The only real reason for the name change was to tell one lens from the other.
Yeah. In the early days, the reason for a fast lens was because they needed more light. Film wasn't as sensitive, but now it's gotten to the stage where people want fast lenses because they get the background blur. I never say that other word with the B. I don't like that word, but they want the background blur, and it's so cool. But it's interesting because when I was young, you would get an f1.4. You'd get a 50 millimeter 1.4. It wasn't uncommon. And it was for light because of low ASA. And how did that change to this obsession with the background blur of you have to shoot wide open to get as much in the background blur as possible?
Well, I have to admit I'm of that school. I like the background blur, not for the blur. Well, some people worry about the quality of the blur, and that doesn't really get my attention. What I like is that if you have a subject that's super sharp and the background is blurred, that your subject just seems to pop right out of the picture.
But so you told me before we started that you were a professional wildlife photographer for 20 years. You can't really get close enough to get that much background blur, can you?
Oh, yeah. You don't have to. The background blur doesn't come from being close. The longer the focal length, the easier it is to get. And with wildlife, you're shooting anywhere from 200 to 800 millimeter equivalents all the time.
That's true. Yeah. See, I never think of it that way. I always think of the more common focal length. I don't use lenses that are too heavy for me to carry. So I never think of that.
Neither do I. I shoot micro four thirds for that reason.
What's interesting is, similar to what Kirk just said, when you have this race for the fastest lens, it's really manufacturers just boasting of maybe their manufacturing prowess, their design prowess, and you have the people who they're going to get that super expensive, super shallow depth of field lens because it is the best. Like we've talked about this on the podcast before, like for some people, the enjoyment of photography is to have the cool thing. And that's fine. And I think a lot of people forget that that's super helpful in low light situations, especially helpful if you are doing something like wildlife or bird photography, not f1, but if you can have like a really long distance f2.8, that means that you can use higher shutter speeds and you can, like all those other aspects of it that we forget about because we think, oh, well, it's an f1.2, so it's got to have this really great background blur, which, yeah, it does. But there are other reasons to do that. And there are other reasons that if you have that lens, you're probably not going to be shooting wide open all the time. That seems like a modern interpretation of how these are used. Is that something that, like through history, has that been important? Or was it just really like, we just need more light?
I think in the early days, of course, with photography, it was just because they needed more light. Diaphragms didn't exist. There was no way to stop down a lens until John Waterhouse came up with his Waterhouse stops in about the 1885, I think, somewhere in there. And they still weren't used a lot until the chemistry got considerably better. The big interesting thing with fast lenses today is that if you get a 1.2 or f1 lens and you want it to look good in the picture, to be sharp, you got to stop it down to f2.8 or f4 anyway. So you begin to wonder, why am I buying this?
Why are you paying more for something you can't use? But then again, there's the obsession with sharpness as well, and that's another debate, isn't it?
It certainly is. Can't think of who it was, but someone said that sharpness was an overrated concept.
Well, I think it was Cartier-Bresson. Didn't he say sharpness is a bourgeois concept?
Yes,
I think it was him. Yeah. A lot of this is about cameras, but what about film? So we know that there was a lot of progress in film in the early days of photography, but then it kind of didn't change very much, did it? I mean, we got color film, which started in the 20s and the 30s and became popular to general people in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. But did we get any more progress in film stocks and film chemistry after, let's say, the 1970s?
Only for speed, and higher speed films, as you well know, became grainier and grainier.
Yep.
And there really wasn't a solution for that. So at high speeds, digital actually works better despite the noise problems. Film is, I think the pinnacle of film was the Kodachrome rather. I've just finished rephotographing about 2,500 slides that my wife's mother made in the 1940s. And the color is excellent, even at this stage. Whereas you take old agphachromes, Anscochrome, Ilfochrome, whatever, they've all faded out. Even the ectochromes, anything that wasn't Kodachrome, uses a different method, and it just doesn't seem to hold up over the time. Colors shift and fade.
It was so good they even wrote a song about it.
Oh, true. Yeah. Paul Simon.
Paul Simon, yeah.
Yeah, it was Coda. I actually quite like that song.
You would, as a photographer. I saw a movie recently, an indie movie, I think it was called Kodachrome, about someone who was in search of the last person who knew how to develop Kodachrome. Is that what it was? Am I remembering that correctly?
I've seen the movie, but it's been a while now.
Yeah, it was quite interesting as a nostalgic look back on film with a young person and an old person.
It's interesting. You talked about the revival of film. I have very few film cameras left. All my grandkids have tried to get one from me so they can experiment with film.
Yep. And
so I keep giving them away.
In fact, the film revival is happening in the cinema. Christopher Nolan is very well known among filmmakers for not only shooting in film, but also working with, the American Film Institute to restore and preserve old movies shot on film.
Yeah. And he's even shooting IMAX in film. And there was only about 7 IMAX film cameras ever made, and he generally has 3 of them in use at any one time.
I watched the film Oppenheimer on Blu-ray, and I watched the special features, and they show the size of these IMAX cameras, which were humongous. And part of the film is in black and white and part is in color, and they had to have a special black and white film made. I think it was a 60 millimeter. I think it might have been Kodak who made it, but it was something special that had never been used before. So there is progress going on in film today, but not for photography, not for still photography.
No, that's true. Some of the improvements will filter into black and white, typically still films. The color films they're too complex in the manufacture to make many changes readily.
I think the big thing about film now is just companies who are now starting to manufacture more of it because of the demand. So not much in terms of quality or advancement, but just to meet a new unexpected demand and have the supply for that.
That's true. There's a whole mess of independent small filmmakers, Adox in Germany, Indus in India. There's even some new films coming out of China that have just been in the news recently that aren't even out yet and already causing some squabbles over who is going to be the distributor in the United States.
Yeah.
But yeah, Czechoslovakia, Italy, Frania's building film again. They're all fairly small productions, a few thousand rolls a week each, but they're filling a need. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, that's something. So we need to wrap up here soon, but one question that I have is, when you were doing this research, when you were looking up the trivia and everything, was there anything in particular that surprised you, that really caught you off guard, that you didn't know about?
That's a hard question to answer, but when I was checking up, there's a famous picture we all know of Orville Wright making his first flight at Kill Devil Hills, the first powered flight. The story that got me was that John T. Daniels was a fellow they had just met. He belonged to the Kitty Hawk life-saving station. He wasn't a photographer, and he took that famous picture, but he had never used a camera nor taken a photograph in his life before.
Wow.
He got lucky.
Struck me odd.
Okay, this has been wonderful. David Young, your book is A Brief History of Photography. Thank you for joining us. I recommend this to anyone who just wants to read this trivia about, not just trivia, but all these little steps in the history of photography to see how much progress has been made since the early days.
And if you'd like to order the book directly from Rocky Nook, you can get a 40% discount using the code YOUNG40, YOUNG 40. You can find links in the show notes, or you can go to rockynook.com.
David, thanks very much for talking with us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, Jeff, let's do snapshots. What have you got this week?
So you recently were talking about a movie or a TV show. It was a TV show. It was that SAS TV show. And that got me thinking of something that we watched recently on Netflix called Black Doves.
I watched it last week.
That's okay, yeah. So Black Doves, it's Keira Knightley and Ben Whishaw, and they basically play spies. One's an assassin, one's a spy. It's very, modern British secret organizations, and I say that and it sounds very sort of rote, but I quite enjoyed it, not just because I think it's pretty well written, but I enjoyed seeing Keira Knightley, and I'm going to say this, and I don't mean it as any sort of a backhanded compliment at all. I enjoyed seeing her as a mature character. So much of her stuff, she's always been like the young, pretty thing, even like in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies where she's an adventurer, etc. And she does a really good job of playing mid-30s or so, maybe
I think a bit older than
early
that,
40s.
yeah.
This well-rounded, mature character. And that shouldn't be a thing that pops out, but she did it so well that it added more depth to the show, and also prevented me from thinking about how Paddington was basically wielding a gun and blowing people away, because Ben Whishaw does the voice of Paddington. So, but his performance is also great. I think it was only like 4 or 6 episodes.
Six episodes,
yeah. But it seemed very tight. A lot of things, interact and overlap. And I just found it to be really compelling watch.
It's funny. I was thinking the same thing, that here's Keira Knightley trying to remake her career. Instead of being in the Jane Austen things and the young ingenue, she's trying to be a serious actress in a serious role. I think she pulled it off really well. The series is created by someone named Joe Barton, and he's the person who created a series that I know I've told you to watch called Giri Haji, which is on Netflix. I think it's Japanese words for duty and shame. And part of it's set in Japan and part of it's set in the UK. It's one of the best TV series I've seen in ages. Unfortunately, there's no second season. But this is created by the same guy.
Kirk, what do you have this week?
I've got a piece of music, and this is something that I was very happy to see released. It's by Brian Eno and Peter Chilvers. It's called Bloom Living World. Now, the Bloom app is one of the earliest iPhone apps. You can create music. It's based on Brian Eno's idea of generative music. Peter Chilvers is his computer guy who's been working with him for a long time. And in the Bloom app, you open your iPhone and you tap, and it plays a note. But the note's cycling through an algorithm that's going to repeat at a higher frequency or a lower frequency and add. And then you can tap 2 fingers and add more notes. And this is a 1 hour-ish Bloom improvisation, I would assume, based on the app. And they just released this a couple weeks ago, and you can get this on all the streaming services. It's called Bloom Living World, Brian Eno and Peter Chilvers.
Cool. Just in time for spring. Bloom.
Well, I was thinking more as music to listen to when you're editing photos. That was my idea.
Okay, that's much better than my
because
attempt
it's
at a
mellow
joke.
ambient music. It's not something that grabs your attention too much. If you've got a streaming subscription, check it out.
Definitely.
All right, that's enough for today. Until next time, Jeff.
Until next time, see you then.
Thanks for listening to Photoactive. You can find show notes, including any photos we discuss in this episode, at photoactive.co. That's photoactive.co. We couldn't afford the M. You can join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/photoactivecast. That's photoactivecast in one word. You can subscribe to Photoactive in your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts. See the links on our website. And think about leaving us a rating or review in iTunes or in your podcast app.